Hello, thank you for joining Legacy Modernization webinar. My name is Ileana. I will be your Zoom producer for today's session. For questions to our speakers, you may use the Q&A feature located on your Zoom toolbar. This call is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect. Without further ado, please welcome Tim Partridge.
Thank you, Ileana. Really appreciate it, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining this regional banking webinar. So my name is Tim Partridge, and I'm going to serve as our host for today. And by way of introduction, I'm a partner in Deloitte's Banking and Capital Markets practice, where I lead large transformational initiatives across portfolio of domestic and global banks. I also serve as our regional banking segment leader, and what an incredibly interesting time it has been to lead this segment. There's been so many changes over the last 3 to 4 years that each of our clients have been dealing with, whether that's starting back at the pandemic and closure of physical branches and having to rapidly shift to digital sales, onboarding, servicing, and then the launch of PPP products for our commercial customers and small businesses. Clearly, with all that liquidity pumped into the market, inflation became a concern, and we saw the most rapid increase of Fed funds rate in history. And when rates are rising that quickly, something is bound to break, right? And so, as we saw about a year ago in early 23, we saw the failures of SVB and Signature, First Republic, and that really ramped up the regulatory scrutiny that each of you are feeling, in particular, scrutiny around capital adequacy. And so, those are just the kind of high-level landscape of the challenges and changes in the market. But one thing that hasn't changed very, very rapidly is just the complex and antiquated technology stacks that the majority of our regional banking clients, currently have. And so it's a tough business now, high funding rates, shrinking margins. And so, as many of you are feeling, investment dollars are just not flowing to technology departments to drive significant modernization of legacy apps. And so that's why we thought today's webinar, today's topic, is certainly something that is very poignant, very timely. And we're really excited to talk to you today about some new approaches, technologies to modernizing your tech stacks. We've been investing in this area for decades in terms of developing our capabilities and supporting tooling that's really going to help you tailor a modernization strategy that's unique to your firm. Use GenAI to rapidly document, decompose, transform these applications, and most importantly, demonstrate tangible outcomes in as little as 30 days. So with that background, I want to first introduce some of our panelists that we have here today. So let me start with Sejal Mukherjee, who leads our application modernization and innovation practice for banking and capital markets. Sejal has close to 4 decades of experience modernizing middle and back office banking applications in both the US and globally. Secondly, we have Arne Gerhard, who's a leader in our application modernization and innovation practice and founded the US branch of Innovake. That's the technology that's behind Deloitte's modernization capabilities. And then finally, we have Martin Fisher, who is a seasoned leader in our application modernization and innovation practice. And Martin joined Deloitte through our acquisition of Innovake, where he successfully oversaw mainframe app modernization and migration projects. So in terms of our agenda, I think I've covered many of our opening remarks, but as you can see, we're going to talk about legacy modernization and regional banking. We're going to do a demo as well, right? So we don't want to just do PowerPoint slides. We want to get you in and see some of the tooling that we have, as well as share some case studies from our clients. We'll also do Q&A, so I'll moderate the Q&A. As Ileana said, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of this, and I'll capture that and either work it into the conversation today or save the Q&A for the end. So that's our plan for today. We're certainly looking forward to it. And let me hand it over to Sejal to take us forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. A very good morning, afternoon to all of you. And thank you for joining us today. Having spent almost my entire career, and that, as Tim was saying, it's close to 4 decades now, in the banking industry, and that too primarily around transformation of middle office and back office systems, This topic of legacy modernization never ceases to amaze me. It's been there right from when I started my career, and we keep talking about it even today. Though when I started, at that time, those applications were being built or had been built, and today we are talking about transforming them. Deloitte has been engaged with several of your peers for various types of initiatives. It could be digital transformation, payments modernization, cloud migration, or even code replacements. All of these engagements, in some form or the other, involve legacy transformation or legacy modernization, or at least they touch the legacy. Our experience shows that the primary drivers for legacy modernization are costs, pretty high costs that you pay for legacy, the dwindling talent pool. You have the people that you have are almost close to retirement or have left, and you're left with a bunch of code which no one really knows what it does, and no one knows how to transform it. The impact on any of your digital transformation efforts, you want to digitalize in order to innovate, in order to be fast, in order to compete, but your legacy applications, they hold you back. And we have some interesting statistics here. So I'll read some of them out. 57% of the companies that were surveyed, they said mainframe modernization was critical for their digital strategy. 23% of your mainframe experts retired in the past 5 years. 67% of the positions could not be filled again. You're unable to attract that mainframe programmers anymore. No one wants to write mainframe code. Up to 74% of costs could be your IT and IT operating costs could be saved by replacing mainframe with modern distributed platforms, not just because of the mainframe cost, but because your business processes are tied to legacy applications. For example, memo post, or as opposed to real-time banking. 70% of all your business transactions are still being processed in COBOL. Pretty interesting statistics. So the need for modernization, I guess, that really does not require too much of debate or doesn't warrant too much of debate. It's pretty well established. However, the speed of modernization has been abysmally slow. I guess all of you would agree with me, especially in the US, and more so in the segment to which you belong, the regional banking segment. Why? The primary reason, as we have seen, is the perception of these being very high-risk endeavors that take too long, cost too much, and at the end of the day, do not deliver measurable business outcomes that you had expected. In other words, there's no business case. We have heard this umpteen number of times, and I'm pretty sure, based on what we see in this segment, many of you might be feeling the same way. So, why? Why does this happen? And what can be done to mitigate it? Next chart, please. So, as we see things, the fundamental reason is that your legacy environment is very, very complex. And most of the banks that we work with have found that they do not really know what is in there. There is no good documentation. Things have changed over a period of time. Layers and layers of code has been written. People who wrote them have left. Many of these regional banks, they think about replacing their core. A lot of these core systems, which were written on mainframes decades back, You now have good alternatives that run on cloud. But replacing your core means extracting your core system, which is so tightly coupled with everything else that you have in your ecosystem. There are too many tentacles, and you do not know which ones they are. So some of our surveys have indicated that almost 50% of the budget for any legacy transformation project goes in just trying to find out what is in there and then using that information to design, figuring out what data is in there, what data comes and goes, and how data gets modified and transformed in the process, figuring out what are the integration points. And many of these things are not known. There are buried business rules within the applications. And the surrounding applications around the core that you want to replace, they themselves account for over 50% of the logic. And about our analysis so far, our experience so far shows that up to 25% of your code might be dead. Also, as based on what happens today, you never know whether you have known everything. You never know whether you have found out everything. There are surprises all the way. So this is where Deloitte comes in. We have the tools, the methods, the approach to solve this problem. At this stage, I would like to request my buddy Martin to explain how we go about doing this. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Sajal, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I want to talk about the methodology that is required to get to successful outcomes. We're doing today a little bit of show and tell, so you will see some fairly technical demos. And I want to make sure that we're clear that it's not a purely technical approach, but it's really business driven. We align the objectives and priorities of our clients with the technical reality that underlies the legacy. So to orient you, we have a slide here that goes through 3 steps. Step number 1 is the discovery step. So it's, as you can see, a top-down, bottom-up step, which is very important to understand. The top-down helps us figure out what the drivers are. So what are your priorities? And we usually look at that from a business, technical, and industry perspective. And then add in any guiding principles that you might have. We then understand or need to understand what are the main business domains or capabilities that drive your business forward. And that will become very important later on. So we usually get to this information through workshops, interviews with the business stakeholders. So having that top-down view is important, but in any mainframe project, the technical reality will catch up with you if you don't look at the bottom up. So that's why we look at a technical discovery that starts with a code scan. So we basically take an X-ray of your mainframe, look at all the technologies that might be in there, legacy languages, databases, any integration points, third-party utilities that you might use from CA, Broadcom, or IBM, the complexity of your code complexity measures, as well as code DNA, which basically tells us similarities that you might have in your code from copy and pasting it over and over again over the decades, or also where the differences lie. We then augment that with technical SME interviews, so talking to technical experts to get additional insight and look at any documentation you might have. Oftentimes, clients really don't have any documentation about the mainframe, and the system of record is the production code. So we then, and I talked about the business capabilities, We then tag the code with the business capabilities or business domains. And that's that colorful picture you can see there. It's called the application network. And it helps us determine the feasibility for the modernization strategies. Arne will go into more detail on how we do this, but I want to talk about step number 2, which is really looking at the modernization strategies and how do we prioritize. So first, we define the disposition strategy and prioritize the business domains or applications. We do that with a simple 2x2 matrix, looking at value add of a certain capability you have on one axis, and then at the strategic contributions or strategic potential of your application on the second axis. In essence, it basically suggests which applications or capabilities do you want to sunset or keep as is, and them do you want to improve or really grow and seize opportunities on. So with that, I want to go to step number 3. After the prioritization, we go into creating a roadmap and executing. And to execute and create the roadmap, we need to know how we can execute and implement against those strategic options. Refactor is the first option shown here. It's basically an automatic one-to-one refactoring of existing functionality from the mainframe to a distributed system or the public cloud. And that's usually done for cost reasons. Again, we can reduce cost, between 50 and 80%. If you don't have time and you have a renewal coming up, it's relatively quick. And it's also relatively low risk because we can measure it against the current mainframe to make sure that it's functionally equivalent. Re-architect in the middle shows us the re-architect and rewrite in the middle is way more engaged. And this is really where we decouple and detangle the mainframe to unlock strategic potential and create new applications or re-architect the existing applications. As it's a higher risk than refactor, but it also has higher reward. And then replace is really looking at the underlying logic. And a lot of the regional banks have, custom off-the-shelf solutions or COTS products or software as a service products that are used that potentially fit for that replacement bucket. So we look at business rule extractions, documenting logic, creating user stories, oftentimes also needed for compliance reason, regulatory compliance, make sure that you actually have things documented that are in your systems. So that's the third column. To bring this to life, I just want to talk about 2 quick examples. Number 1 could be, let's say you have a product that you want to introduce, maybe a new or improved savings product. So you likely want to have an enticing user experience for your clients. Again, you need to update your products and you want to get to a specific business outcome. In this case, you want to increase your deposit base, right? So that would fall in the strategic matrix quadrant, and it would be likely addressed because it is strategic and it's not existing functionality. It would likely be addressed with a combination of rewriting and re-architecting, or looking at the current logic, potentially replacing with the COTS product. So you see that there is a mapping between the disposition strategy as well as the actual dispositions during execute. Another quick example, and this is not quick in implementation, is core replacements, but we see it quite often in the regional banking space. Multi-year, really engaged projects. And as you can imagine, and going back to what Sajal is saying, you have a lot of custom solutions built around the core. And understanding those custom solutions with mining to get the logic out of there is a really important first step, so that you can then look which of the logic is already covered by your new core platform, which of the logic might need to be extended as a, as customization in the core platform, and which of the logic can stay where it is and can be refactored. So you see that there is always a combination of the different execution options for your tailored modernization roadmap. On the next chart, I want to briefly go through the unique capabilities and outcomes. So for discovery, the outcome is an executable plan aligned with the business objectives. It sounds simple, but it's really important to get this right the first time. These projects can span months, sometimes years or multi-years, cost a lot of money, and be a huge effort for your team. And you want to get this right the first time. And oftentimes what we see is that there is maybe a consulting coming in and talking about strategic portfolio analysis and basically figuring out, this is great, this is how you should orient your future IT, without really looking at the underlying tech stack, right? So looking from both sides, the business side as well as the technology side, is really important. And we bring the subject matter expertise on both sides with our very mature financial services practice, but also doing this type of engineering where Arne and I are from Innovate, doing this for over 20 years, and really having a mature product to look at the bottom up, as we call it. Secondary, I want to look briefly at the mining. Extracting the buried business rules is the outcome there. And again, there's decades-old systems with poor documentation. Developers have left or are about to retire. And so this is one of the areas where we can really shine with our mature mining platform to get rules out at a really high efficiency. And this is now also supercharged with some GenAI capabilities that have been added to the product over the last 2 years, which Arne will demonstrate in 1 minute. And then finally, from a modernization perspective, really decoupling the monolith and into a componentized architecture is what a lot of our clients are after. And it is very complex, monolithic systems, very intertwined with countless dependencies, convoluted data flows, etc. So developing or having a decomposition tool on the bed that helps you really make sense of all that complexity is extremely important. So with that, I will hand over to Arne Gerhard to show us some of this stuff in action.
Thank you, Martin. With that, I will need. Okay, fantastic. So what we're looking at here is something that we actually uncovered with a client. This is a application network of a mainframe system. And we can imagine that these colors are the business areas we've tagged, and the connections are how closely linked these implementations in the mainframe language like COBOL are with each other and the data. And this is something that we frequently see. You might imagine the red heart of this graph to be the core logic. And this core logic underlies and branches out into almost every aspect of the system. While something like the green, light green thing you see on the right is maybe a more decoupled already ancillary system to the rest of the mainframe. And then we can start having discussions about, well, first of all, what is inside this green blob? That is where the business rule mining comes in. And then how much dependency do I have on the rest of the system? So I can figure out, well, if I want to start decoupling the mainframe and slicing away at this monolith, how much work and risk is it to take it out? So this graph gives that kind of overview. And the tools we have that I'm going to show a very high level overview of support doing this work without people having to do the deep dive into the code, but we have the tools that do all this tracing. The mainframe system, that tracing is very, very complex because not only can COBOL programs call each other, they depend on data. The data might be used by various different parts of the mainframe. And there's all this technology in there from CICS to MQ series to IMS, TM, and all these things that allow the dependencies to interconnect. Okay, with that, I will go to sharing the screen. If you could please allow me to share the screen. Fantastic. The first tool I'm going to show you is the database cutter tool that allows us to look at the data. And then what's unique about this is that not only do we look at the data, but we also trace the dependencies with the data into the code and then follow those traces back up all the way through the entire graph. So the first thing I'm going to show is a little relational database schema that this here visually displays. And I can zoom in and look into the details of this. But when I put the code into the picture as well, I have these little squares that are my database tables, and I have these round bubbles that are the modules that access them. And if I go into here, I see that there is a business context that reaches out to programs, that reaches out to tables. And if I go ahead and increase the depth by just 1 to see how far this graph branches out, I'm starting to get a little bit of an overview of my module, how this one module branches out into others, and all the other data that depends on. So my job with this tool is to say, well, how can I slice and dice this situation to make my modules independent of the other parts of the mainframe monolith? And ideally, we do this job by cutting by module, cutting by table. And I'm not going to go into the details of this because it's not too interesting to see. It's the job we do where we define, well, if I have a table that has multiple people accessing it, what is my strategy for decomposing? If it's read-only access, which the colors of the line represent, then I can say, well, it might be a good idea to just change data, capture that data out to my target architecture, and then allow the read-only access. If it's read and write access, maybe I have to create an interface to a service. The idea of this being that I get a nice and decoupled graph at the end. I'm going to change how we are viewing this to an organic type that gives me a little bit better understanding. So as this re-renders, I look into my business area. Each business area contains code, and the code itself accesses database tables. So this is now what the tool produces in real time. The yellow dots or these colored dots or the green dots are my modules. And the little gray squares are the database tables they access. So I see a few database tables that are accessed by multiple business areas. So I want to define my data migration strategy for that. And the many different connections I see are the ones that I need to minimize if my target is having a separated system. So for example, if the yellow blob is something I want to turn into a microservice, I want to reduce to a minimum any connections to shared data or to the other systems to have a clean and small interface. So that is my tool to use bottom-up tracing of the code together with top-down analysis of how the business functions to find out how to separate the system. Okay, so just a brief overview of that. The next tool I'm going to go and show you is the database, the code mining capability. This is a tool that does all of the basics. We take in the code, we do a basic analysis of what's actually inside the system. We see the technology used. We see a couple of charts we can produce on the fly, what kind of programming languages, transaction monitor, batch jobs, and things like that. We look at the third-party utilities, and all these graphs come up. But what I wanted to point out is that we actually have a data dictionary that defines what the data is and what it means in the business context. And then we can look at modules and say, well, what are the business rules hidden inside the programs? So I can take a piece of code here and say, what is this code? I can look at the people that are mining this. These are people. They need to find out what does it mean in its context. So I can look at a dependency graph and I see that this program sits within a batch job. And if I dial up the level of depth, I go again here to see how this fits into my bigger context and how complex my entire system is. I'll see that this is usually the case with many mainframe applications. It's pretty complex. So I'll give this a few seconds to render. And if it takes too long, I'm going to bail on it. There we go. It showed up just when I bailed on it. Okay. I'll go back to that program. This was really just, the idea of this was to show that, yes, it traces everything. I'll go back to the same program. I can also look at the data lineage, which means for any field in my COBOL code, how does it go to the database? Is it just a working storage variable that gets reassigned, moved, a subprogram gets called, a stored procedure gets called, and that's how it ends up in the database? Is it a bottom-up computation? That's what the data lineage follows. And my control flow graph shows me what the control flow inside the code is. I'm not going to go into details of that. But instead, I'll look at the code. So this is where you have actual COBOL code and you want to see what it's doing. And our process is to understand what this code is and what it does. So for example, if I find the compute interest section here, we have miners that go in there and find out what is this code really doing. So I have to understand what it is. This is a manual process. If we start putting GenAI and large language models into this context, well, we can feed what we know about the system, the dependency graph, its context, the data lineage, and the data dictionary. So to support the LLM in understanding what this code does. So if I have this working storage monthly variable here from the data dictionary and its dependency and data lineage, it knows what that means. So instead of having to have a human do this, now the LLM created the definition of that business rule. And this way I can go in there and massively accelerate the process of understanding what an application does. So if we go through an entire application, an entire mainframe application this way, very soon we have a complete understanding. But we also take this one step further and say, well, I really want to see the source code and ask it questions. So if I have completely new people looking at my mainframe, I really want to understand what it's doing. So I can say, explain the login procedure using text and a chart. And this uses, again, all the context I have to understand what does the word login procedure even mean. And it looks at what its context is and does this explanation. And if we look at this a little bit, this is really how a mainframe login procedure is programmed. So it really understands what's going on. Is the first character a PF3 key, display a thank you message, display an invalid key message? If I had a web-based or a newly implemented login procedure, this flow would look very, very different. But for every module that's involved in this, I can also go to the details of it and see where the code implementation is. So we all know GenAI, we don't really know how much it confabulates things. We can still have people verify that it actually documented the correct process. So if I go back to the piece of code we just looked at, that was the interest calculation. I can say, explain that as a user story. So then the GenAI goes ahead and says, well, I actually now can document the legacy user story of what the code is doing as a user, blah, 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 blah. And if you might have read a little bit of code, you might recognize that it was doing a division by 1200 in this process. So we can take this legacy user story to the next step and actually do the implementation. And any human language understanding I want to put in here, I can say, well, my business requirement is changing. Now I want to divide by 1400 instead of 1200, or whatever the new business requirement is. We then allow adding technical requirements to this implementation. Many of our clients have frameworks they want to use, like Spring Boot or internal corporate frameworks that we can then add as the technical requirement for the implementation and start generating the code. This step takes quite some time. So let's see if it actually finishes, because the LLM needs to do quite some thinking. With this code implementation, we also generate the test cases with a grain of salt from the LLMs, but it is at least a great starting point for a new implementation of the mainframe system. So Where this is different from other GenAI approaches in the market is we take the understanding of the code to create a user story and then implement the user story again using the LLM instead of just translating code using the LLM that will give us the very same implementation without any of the legacy debt that is often inside these implementations removed. So we are really taking it to another level of abstraction, to a higher level with an implementation that is very independent of how the mainframe did things. So I can go to relational databases instead of flat files or GDGs. I can change how my interface implementation works and all these things. So this generation is taking too long. So I'm just going to hand over back to Sajal from this screen. Sajal?
Thanks, Arndt. Thank you. Wasn't that cool? So now let's summarize what we saw. So the need to transform legacy is known. We also know it's not easy. The unknowns, they act as obstacles and dampeners. Deloitte does have a solution for you. Now let's see how we can make this real for you. Time is of essence. We don't believe in long-drawn strategy engagements. We believe in action. We have several offerings where we come and deliver something concrete for you in 30, 60, or 90 days. It could be a report which tells you exactly what you have in your legacy stack, all the technologies that you're using interfaces, dependencies, the code quality, complexity of the code, program similarity, etc. We could actually go into your code and discover your business rules, extract them, document them for use, for anything else that you want to do, and for posterity. We could also come and do a full modernization journey for you. That takes longer, about 3 months, where we come and look at your, again, we start with full analysis of your code. We start with your business objectives and goals, as we talked about, as Martin explained to you. And we create a prioritized roadmap for you, including cost estimates and business cases. So we expect that these kind of offerings could add direct value to you. It could accelerate your journey. And what we also saw is that legacy modernization is much, much more than just providing a technology solution. It is about how your partner engages with you. Now let's see what one of our customers feels about the work that we did for them. In this case, the customer actually went ahead and migrated from mainframe by refactoring their code from COBOL to Java. Let's see what they say.
My name is Richard Sanders. I'm the IT Director of Nationale Nederland. The last couple of years, we managed to successfully migrate our old mainframe systems to a new Java platform.
My name is Erwin van der Ploeg. I'm a project manager at NN. I've been helping out Deloitte for the past 2 years executing this project. People having knowledge of the mainframe platform are getting scarcer and scarcer over the years. Our developers are reaching their retirement age in the coming period, and they will even retire. And that leaves NN with quite a significant brain drain.
Yeah, and the other thing is the money. Running the mainframe became increasingly expensive the last couple of years, and we were about to sign a new long-year license agreement, which would have made it even more expensive. Deloitte showed us they had a lot of experience in these kind of migrations, and they had a very good track record.
Also during RFP phase, Deloitte showed that they are capable of automating the transformation of the code. Their solution is pretty complete, so covering all of our techniques that we use, and we have a single party we can work with and not all kind of subcontractors.
We started with a so-called discovery phase, in which we did an in-depth analysis of our IT landscape, and based on that, we drew up a project plan.
Deloitte picked up that plan, basically took control over the program and led the program, guiding NN through it. The biggest part that they took on was converting automatically the code into Java, and NN needed to bring in the application knowledge. And jointly, we made it a success.
First of all, we saved a lot of money, around 80%, but we also were able to avoid extra costs. And the other thing is we now have a renewed foundation for our business to build further on.
And with that new platform, it enabled us to attract new, young Java developers and avoiding the brain drain I earlier talked about.
First, we started by drawing up an extensive contract, but we put it in a drawer immediately and started working as a team, as one team. Beside that, Deloitte committed to time and money.
In addition to that, from a content perspective, we were pretty amazed that the transformed code delivered exactly the same functionality. Also, during the project, we merely had technical problems, no calculation problems, no rounding errors. And next to that, we were pretty amazed by the help the technical engineers from Deloitte gave us.
It was an enormous change in an environment who wasn't used to changing a lot. Some of the programs were from the 60s or the 70s of the last century. So we had to overcome a lot of resistance in the beginning.
And also the decisive moments just before go live were pretty hard. In the end, Deloitte helped us out a lot with giving proper aftercare and ensuring that the applications worked properly in production.
We cannot deliver this kind of project without our clients' help and without their functional expertise and their knowledge of the applications. NN is a great example of that, because they had to mobilize their limited development team capacity to support the project, and that made all the difference.
This type of project may seem scary, but as we have shown at NN, with a real partnership in place, high mutual trust, and especially real leadership commitment, we make this a success.
So 80% cost reduction, isn't that amazing? So we saw you we showed you a customer testimony, and I hope you see as to how we engage with our partners, with our customers. So now you know our approach, you know what we can do for you. I would request you to ask any questions that you might have, and over to you, Tim, to see what kind of questions have come in and if there is anything that we could answer right away.
Perfect. Thanks, Sejal. I did field a few questions throughout the presentation today. So let me start off with one. So how can you help if my current core vendor is unwilling to give access to the source code?
Well, that's a very, very tricky one. Yes, in the absence of source code, it is difficult to go in and figure out all the rules and logic that is inside the application that you're thinking of replacing with some other system, or you're thinking about transforming yourself. So, however, whenever we have come to situations like this, we have seen that it is not just about what you have inside, but also about what you have around it. That is equally important. So while you may not have access to the source code of that specific application, you will certainly have access to the code around it, which you most likely you have developed in-house. In that case, we go and analyze the source code that sits around it, and from there we try to figure out what kind of data comes in, what kind of data moves out, what kind of integrations are there, what kind of requests come in, what kind of responses go out. So at the very least, you understand this particular application for which you do not have access to the source code, you can understand it as a black box.
Great. Thank you. Second question I got in, I think the demo from the client there, or testimonial from the client was well received. But a follow-on question to that is, have you worked with any regional banks in the U.S. in the area of legacy modernization?
Many. We are working with several of them, even as we speak now. And many of these, they revolve around, I mean, they do not, by themselves, they are not called out as legacy modernization. They could be having a different entry points. For example, digital transformation or payments modernization or core replacement. It could be called by different names. But at the end of the day, as I said earlier in when I was talking, they all touch the legacy code. And there is an element of legacy discovery and trying to change some of the legacy code as you undertake these initiatives. And we have many such engagements going on.
Great. Maybe one final question here. So what sort of involvement or engagement would we typically expect from the bank that we're engaging with on one of these efforts? You know, everybody's stretched real thin with resources, and we know that the IT department is limited in their budget. So how do we typically engage with across a host of stakeholders at any one of our clients?
Excellent question. Martin, Arne, would one of you like to take that?
Yeah, sure. And we actually just went through a project not too long ago. I just concluded in January here. And it was about pretty much documenting business rules and business capabilities, but understanding all of the legacy behind it. It was a system about 600,000 lines of code, all kinds of, you know, legacy grown over, I think, 50 years. So it's been quite a bit. And in order to understand this, the client was concerned that we would need their SME, so their subject matter experts, for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the code is the truth. They didn't have much of the system documentation, or it was in different formats and different people documented in different ways. So really aligning this came from our team and the technology behind it, looking at the code and turning it into translations that can be extracted and documented and then turned into user stories. So again, obviously any kind of SME support helps, specifically early on in the project, having workshops with our clients to understand what they know and what they don't know is really important for us to set the right stage, and then to stay out of their hair for their regular business, at least those SMEs, so that you know, they can focus on what they need to do while we can help them with their modernization journey. So the short answer to this is, it's not required that we have, you know, long-winded conversations or access to SMEs. In many cases, there are none, and we find out these underlying a document without having the need for SMEs.
Great, Nikki, that was perfect. Well, with that, I think we'll conclude today's webinar. Sejal, maybe I'll share some closing remarks, and feel free to add. But I just want to thank everybody for being here. This is clearly a topic that we're having many discussions with many clients across the marketplace. As I said at the beginning, we know it's challenging time to do these you know, significant investments, but we do have tools, as you saw today, to accelerate these and do them in a time effective as well as cost effective manner. So look forward to continuing the discussion. If anybody here you know, wants to have a more detailed conversation about their specific situation, don't hesitate to reach out. We'll be sharing you know, a link to the materials and video post the session as well. So thank you for your time today, and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.